At a crowded birthday party, my daughter-in-law knocked a plate of food onto the floor. She slapped me twice and shouted, "You're nothing but filthy, stinking trash. My husband deserves a better father." My son grabbed both my arms tightly from behind and yelled, "Take your mother and get out of our house." I didn't fight back. I simply took my wife's hand and walked out the door. 20 minutes later, my lawyer called. They just found out. I have been waking up at 4:00 in the morning for 35 years. Not because an alarm forces me out of bed. Not because I programmed a reminder into some phone the way my son does. It's something older than that. Something that lives in the body after enough decades of early mornings, a kind of quiet discipline that no one handed to me and no one can take away. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you found your way here today. If you're new, consider tapping subscribe. So the next story comes straight to you. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, is it morning where you are afternoon? Or are you listening late at night when the house is finally quiet? Tell me in the comments. There's something about a still house that makes a story like this one land differently. One quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. My body never needed an alarm. It knows when the doc is expecting me, and in 35 years it has never once decided that sleep mattered more than the work. Dolores used to find this funny when we were newlyweds. Mornings bitter cold, her burrowing deeper under the covers and calling out, "Leonard Garrett, the Lord himself, took a day off." I'd press my lips to her forehead and remind her that the Lord wasn't expecting a halibut delivery before 5. Her laugh was muffled by the pillow. Years gone now, but on the still mornings when fog blankets Depot Bay and the air tastes of salt and open water, I can still find it if I listen. This town is in my blood, the old canneries standing along the water's edge, the sea lions raising a racket at the tour boats off Newport Bay front. That particular afternoon light off the Pacific that gilds everything for exactly 20 minutes before it surrenders to dusk. I was raised 2 streets from the shoreline. I married a woman who had grown up 1 street nearer to it, and I gave 35 years to a fish stall at the old Bayfront market that became, alongside Dolores and my children, the thing I was proudest of in this life. Hold all of that in mind when I tell you about June 22nd, the 4 Voyageur mornings, the Dungeness crab bay shrimp, 2 whole halibut that weighed nearly 14 libs between them. I hauled off Calvin Mead's boat with my own hands. The 6 hours I stood in that kitchen, the day of Camille's birthday party, working through fish, I had chosen myself at the dock before daybreak, clean, seasoned, arranged on platters, while Dolores laid the table and my daughter-in-law sat in a styling chair at a salon on Herbert Street. Keep those things close, because what I'm about to describe took place in the house I built, the rooms where my children pulled themselves upright and took their first steps. The kitchen where Dolores and I had sat across from each other at breakfast for 31 years before any of this unraveled. The evening opened the way every gathering does when Camille is organizing it. Loud, overflowing, 16 people packed into a living room with no business holding 16 people. All of them, Camille's friends and relations, wine glasses, raised voices competing, while the Bluetooth speaker fought for space against the laughter rolling out of the far corner, where Derek was deep into a story I'd sat through twice before. I moved through it all, carrying trays, topping off glasses, setting out the shrimp. The crab legs, the grilled halibut that had cost me more than I'll say here, smiling at faces I couldn't always name because Camille had never taken the trouble to properly introduce me to most of them. A woman touched my arm and asked if I was with the catering company. I told her the house was mine. She blinked, then wandered off toward the cheese. My grandson Caleb had wedged himself into the corner by the fireplace, those long legs of his, bent underneath him, studying the room the way a 14-year-old does when something feels wrong, but he hasn't got the words for it yet. Phone in hand, our eyes met once. He gave me a small single nod, the kind that says I see it too and I hate it, and I don't know what there is to do. I returned the nod. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Dolores sat at the far end of the table in quiet talk with one of Camille's aunts. I could read her shoulders from where I stood, the set of them, the stiffness. She'd worn the green dress she saved for occasions she wanted to feel dignified at, both hands resting flat in her lap, the way they always rest when she is holding herself together by force of will. An hour after the food went out, once the guests had eaten, I reached for the chair beside Dolores. My feet were done. My lower back had been filing its grievances since 2 hours in the afternoon. I was 68 years old, and I had been standing since before first light. I had cooked that meal. I owned that house. I had been married to that woman for 41 years, and I intended to sit beside her and eat. Camille materialized at my side before I made it to the seat, white wine in hand, wearing the look she always put on when there were witnesses and she wanted to make a point. "That pile in the sink isn't going to wash itself," she announced. She said it loud enough that the nearby conversations thinned out. I drew myself up slowly. My spine made its protest and looked first at her, then at the sink stacked with the pots and boards from a morning's worth of work, then back at her. "I've had my feet under me since 4:00 this morning, Camille," I said. "I'm sitting down to eat before I do anything else." She tipped her head to one side, the performance of patience she put on for people she considered beneath her. "The guests haven't gone yet, Leonard. I'm aware of that," I said. "I'm the one who opened the door to them." Her face changed. The wineglass struck the table a hard, deliberate click. Then, without a word of warning, she drove her arm across the serving dishes and sent the butter bowl launching off the edge. It crashed to the floor and threw a wide yellow slick across the hardwood, splashing across the shoes Dolores had buffed the previous evening. The room sealed itself in silence. Camille lifted the dish towel from the oven rail and let it drop at my feet. "Then get on the floor and deal with it," she said. Dolores's chair shrieked back. "Camille, leave this alone." Fast words edged with fury, and I saw my wife's whole body absorb them, a sharp, involuntary flinch, as though she'd been snapped with something. That was the instant my patience ran out. I moved toward Camille and met her eyes without looking away. "You will not speak to my wife that way," I told her. "Not under this roof, not anywhere else." Not one of the 16 people in that room made a sound. Camille placed her wineglass on the table. She moved toward me, and I will give you every detail of what followed, because I have run it back so many times I could recite each second. Her right arm drew back. The first strike hit my left cheek and spun my head sideways. The second landed before I'd fully registered the first. "You are nothing but a filthy, stinking piece of trash," she said, voice flat and unhurried and carrying no remorse at all. "My husband deserves a real father." Behind me I heard motion. Both arms were seized and yanked back, pinned. Derek's mouth was close to my right ear, his voice unnervingly steady, the steadiness of someone who has been rehearsing this. "Take your mother and your garbage and get out of our house, Dad." I stayed still, looked at the butter spreading across the floor, looked at Dolores, standing now, both palms pressed to the tabletop, tears sliding down her face while her jaw stayed rigid. I looked at Caleb, chalk white in his corner, his phone clasped to his chest in both fists. Then I took in the room. Every face, all that held in silence. "Let go of my arms, Derek," I said. He released them. I moved to Dolores' side and gathered her hand into both of mine. "We're leaving," I said. "Come with me, Dolores." She closed her grip on my hand so tight I felt the pressure in my knuckle bones. We passed through the kitchen, past the meal I had made, past the guests who stepped aside without speaking, and through the front door of the house I had held the deed to for 31 years. The air off Depot Bay struck my face like a plunge into cold water. Dolores trembled next to me. I held her hand and kept moving to the truck, got her door open, went around to my own side, and settled behind the wheel. For a full 2 minutes, I did not reach for the ignition. I was not crying. I want that on the record. 68 years old, an entire life of rising before the rest of the world and shouldering whatever the day demanded. I was not about to weep in my own driveway over what my son and his wife had just done to me. I was working something through. Then my phone stirred in my shirt pocket. I drew it out and read the screen. Franklin Draper, my lawyer, my friend of 30 years. I picked up. "Leonard," Franklin said. "They just found out." Franklin's words followed me the entire drive to Audra's place that evening. 4 words, and every one of them lodged somewhere deep like a barb sunk into tissue that had no business being pierced. I'm running ahead of the story, though. To make sense of what Franklin was telling me, you'd have to know what those 3 years leading up to that call actually contained. It means going back to a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, when Derek pulled out a chair at my kitchen table and set a piece of paper in front of me with a single number on it. $800 per month increase. That was how much his landlord was bumping the rent. He and Camille had lived in their apartment on Coast Highway for 4 years when the building changed hands, sold off to a property management outfit from Portland that had apparently decided Newport was now the sort of town where a young family ought to hand over $800 a month more than they'd ever agreed to. He slid that paper toward me, the way you might present a document in a dispute. "We can't make it work, Dad," he said. "Not with the car payments, Caleb's school fees, all of it." I took a long look at the figure. Then I took a long look at my son. 40 years old, built wide through the shoulders. That's a Garrett trait with his mother's dark eyes, and this thing he does where he rubs the back of his neck the moment something has him unsettled. He was doing it right then. "How long would you need?" I said. 6 months, he told me. Maybe a stretch more, just long enough to set aside what they'd need to find a proper place. Dolores was at the kitchen counter behind him, and when I glanced past Derek's shoulder, our eyes met. 41 years of marriage had taught me every register of that look. It wasn't generous, but she held her tongue because Dolores has always known which decisions are mine to make, and I'd already made this one. "Come home," I said to Derek. "Put the money away. When the right place turns up, you'll be ready." He leaned over and put his hand around my forearm. "Thanks, Dad." I nodded and mentioned a delivery due at 5 I was needed back at the dock. Both of those things were true. The third true thing was that I process situations better when there's something physical to occupy me, when my hands have work and the salt air is moving around me. Camille showed up 3 days after that with a moving van and a quality I can only call intentional energy. She moved those movers through my front door, as though she'd drawn up the floor plan the week before, which sat a little strangely with me, considering she was arriving as a guest into a home someone else had furnished and arranged. The living room furniture was in new positions before the afternoon was out. Within the first week, she had swapped out the curtains in the front bedroom for gray linen ones she'd picked up at a home goods store in Cannon Beach. Dolores had put white cotton curtains in that room the year Audra came into the world. I kept my mouth shut about the gray linen. I told myself it didn't amount to much. Caleb was 11 at the time, a reserved kid, his mother's cheekbones on his face and a head for numbers that every teacher felt compelled to mention at conference time. That first Saturday, he wandered into my fish stall and planted himself at the counter, watching the way a boy watches something he's genuinely trying to figure out. I walked him through how the scale worked. I handed him a small bag of clams to carry over to a woman waiting nearby. He moved like the bag was made of something precious, gripping it in both hands, and she thanked him not once, but twice. "That's a fine boy," she said to me once he'd settled back into his book. "Yes," I told her, "he is." The first few months weren't something I'd call a disaster. I'll say that plainly because a story that's cleaner than what happened isn't worth telling. Derek was more useful around the place than I'd counted on. The sagging gutter above the back porch, the one that had been drooping since the previous winter, he sorted it out. When I was at the market and Dolores had appointments, he drove her. There were evenings when all 4 of us sat together at the long table, and Caleb would relay something that had caught his attention at school that day. In those hours, an hour maybe 2, the arrangement had the feeling of something that could hold. But Camille moved through the house with an attention I struggled to put a name to at first. The pace of it, the deliberateness. It was the pace of someone assessing square footage and storage, not someone settling in. She'd open a cabinet door and stand there. One afternoon I came down the hall to find her, framed in the doorway of the master bedroom, arms folded, head angled, sizing up the room like a contractor reviewing scope. When she noticed me, she offered a smile pleasant enough on the surface, but her eyes weren't participating. "The light in here is just gorgeous, isn't it, Leonard?" Sure enough, I said it was. About 2 weeks on, she brought up sleep trouble, she and Derek. She said couldn't get comfortable because the mattress in their room was too soft. Would Dolores and I think about trading rooms for a spell just while a replacement was being arranged? Dolores had her back to us, working at the stove. She didn't turn. I told Camille we'd stay where we were. She said of course she completely understood and drifted back to whatever had been occupying her. Later, after the lights were out, Dolores spoke toward the ceiling. "Leonard, something about that woman's eyes." I said she was overtired and reading into things. I was wrong about that. Part of me knew it the moment the words left my mouth, the part you don't let yourself listen to until you're standing in the wreckage of what the not listening cost and realizing it was someone else who paid the bill. By October, the curtains were only the beginning of what had shifted. A rug materialized in the living room that hadn't been there before. The kitchen shelves were in a different order. The hook beside the front door, I'd been dropping my truck keys on it every evening for 20 years. now displayed Camille's salon rewards card alongside a small tag that read, "Our Place," in cursive lettering. My keys went into my jacket pocket after that. I said nothing about the tag. 6 months passed, and then a seventh, and then an eighth. Each time I raised it with Derek, something had come up. The market wasn't cooperating. A unit they'd liked had fallen apart at the last minute. The moment wasn't right. I listened to all of it, gave a nod each time, and kept hauling myself to the dock at 4:00 every morning, telling myself that families endure rough patches, and what this one needed was patience from me. Dolores had gone quiet. That bothered me more than any curtain or rearranged shelf ever had. The first note turned up on a Tuesday morning in November of 2021. I'd walked in from the dock at 11 carrying the smell of Dungeness crab and salt water, the way I always do. And my mind was on something simple, a hot shower, a bowl of Dolores's clam chowder, not a thing beyond that. But there it was, on the kitchen counter, a note folded in half and set squarely beside my coffee mug, placed just so, in a way that made clear it wasn't an accident. I opened it, Camille's handwriting compact, tidy letters, the script of someone who wants to appear orderly and keeps everything else well beneath the surface. It said, "Laundry in the dryer needs folding. Towels on the line need bringing in. Caleb has practice at 5. He needs a ride. Grocery list on the fridge, we're out of the good olive oil." I stood there and went through it twice. Then I took stock of the kitchen around me. Camille's car wasn't in the drive. Derek was at his job. Dolores was lying down in the back bedroom. Her knees had given her grief since October, and the doctor had been firm about afternoons off her feet. I folded the note back the way I'd found it and left it on the counter. Then I went and dealt with the laundry. I want to be straight about why. It wasn't fear of Camille. It wasn't any belief that she held authority over how I spent my afternoon. I did it because those were tasks sitting undone, because I was the one present, and because Dolores wasn't able to. That's what I was brought up to do. My mother had a word for it being useful. I used the same word. What hadn't yet landed for me was that Camille didn't see usefulness as a trait worth honoring. To her it was a lever, something to pull. The notes kept coming. Some days just one. Some days 2 notes would be waiting occasionally, 3 each one, staking out a different corner of the house and what it expected from me before supper. By January of 2022, I could have set my afternoon schedule by them, the way other men check a clock. Come in from the dock, find the notework, through it sweep out the garage, wipe down the stovetop wheel, the recycling to the curb, collect Caleb, swing by the grocery store on Benton Street, and pick up the specific brand of sparkling water that Camille preferred, not the store brand, the one in the blue bottle. Dolores watched all of it from a remove that widened with each passing week. One evening in February, she walked into the kitchen while I stood at the sink washing dishes from a meal I hadn't eaten. Yet Camille had asked me to clean up before sitting down, and Dolores placed her hand flat on the counter beside me and said, "Leonard, you are this family's father, not its housekeeper." I told her I knew that. "Then stop conducting yourself like you don't," she said. "It keeps things smoother," I said. "Less friction all around." She held me in a long look. I recognized the same expression she'd worn the time I assured her the roof was fine, and it caved into part of the back porch 6 weeks later. Then she carried herself off to bed without touching the rest of her tea. I stayed at the sink and listened to the foghorns drifting in off the water, and told myself she was worn out, that things would level off once Derek and Camille found their own footing. I was 67 years old and had been polishing that particular story for the better part of 4 months. I was getting quite practiced at it. Loretta Pierce ran the produce stall right beside mine at the old Bayfront Market, and she'd occupied that spot on the dock for 19 years. A solid woman out of Corvallis gray hair, kept in a braid a laugh that carried 3 stalls down, even on the loudest Saturday mornings. She had a way of reading people the way a seasoned farmer reads soil, quiet observation, no fanfare. In March, she looked at me across the low partition dividing our stalls and said, "Len, you look like a man hauling someone else's furniture up 4 flights of stairs." "Just tired," I told her. "You've been just tired since November," she said. "That's not tired anymore. That's something different." So I told her about the living situation, not the full account, just the rough outline of it, the way you sketch a thing when you're still inside it and the edges haven't come clear yet. Loretta listened all the way through without cutting in, which was among the qualities I valued most in her. When I finished, she said, "Is she paying rent?" I said rent hadn't come up between us. Loretta lifted a head of lettuce and turned it over with more scrutiny than it really called for. Bring it up, she said. I pivoted to the weekend weather, which was my reliable exit from any conversation. I wasn't ready to sit inside. The crab came in. The notes kept coming, and somewhere in that same run of months, Camille started asking for fish. Not the way a person in the household asks. Not, "Dad, would it be all right if we had salmon this week?" She asked the way someone places an order with a supplier. Lists began arriving on my phone by text in the early morning, before I'd even left for the dock. 2 lbs of halibut, a dozen oysters, whatever Dungeness crab Calvin had coming off the boat Thursday. She described the fish as being for friends, for dinner parties, for a neighbor who'd done her a kindness. I brought what she listed, because the fish was there, and she was family, and I told myself that was what the word stood for. It didn't occur to me to tally the pounds. It didn't occur to me to put a dollar figure to it. I was 67 tired in the precise way Loretta had named it, and every morning the dock was waiting, and the catch was coming in, and there was always the next task before I could stand still long enough to see the wider shape of things. That version of myself is the one I carry the least pride about. Not the man who absorbed the blows, the man who kept folding the laundry and never asked why. Derek came to me on a Tuesday evening in June and lowered himself into the kitchen chair with his elbows on the table and his gaze on his own hands. He said he needed to talk to me about money. My stomach pulled tight the way it does when the shape of something is already plain before the words show up to confirm it. "How much?" I said. $12,000, Derek said. He was still staring at his hands when he said it, and that told me he'd rehearsed the number enough times to deliver it steady, but not enough times to say it while meeting my eyes. I drew out the chair across from him and sat down. The kitchen clock read 6:47 in the evening. Through the window over the sink, the light was going orange across the rooftops. That particular late June quality Newport light has the kind that makes the whole town look like a painting someone couldn't quite bring themselves to call finished. "Tell me what it's for," I said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not for me, Dad. It's for a friend, Marcus. You don't know him. He works up at the warehouse in Corvallis. His wife had a medical situation, and the bills landed fast, and he can't bridge the gap. He just needs it for a few weeks, maybe a month. He's good for it, I promise. I'll make sure he pays you back directly." I looked at my son. He was 41 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's build and a way of moving through the details of a story, quickly skating past particulars. I'd clocked that in him since his teenage years. When Derek wanted something, the narrative around it always picked up pace. "A month," I said. "Maybe 6 weeks at the outside," he said. "I wouldn't come to you if Marcus had any other option, but he's in a bad spot." I told him I might be able to help. I sat with it for the amount of time it takes to measure whether a man means what he says, which for me has always been less about the words than the hands. Derek's palms were still and flat against the table, which meant he was working to appear calm, and that is not the same thing as being calm. But he was my son, and I have extended money to people I trusted less than my own son, for reasons that mattered less than a friend's medical bills. I told myself that. I transferred $12,000 from savings into Derek's account through online banking the next morning at 7:15 before I left for the dock. I didn't ask for anything written down. I set no repayment schedule. I closed the laptop and walked out and didn't turn it over in my mind again for several weeks, which is what you do when you trust the person. The vanity arrived on a Thursday. I came home from the dock that afternoon to find a delivery truck sitting at the curb and 2 men in gray uniforms carrying a large flat box through the front door with the deliberate care of people moving something costly. I stood on the porch and watched them go. Camille was directing them toward the master bedroom with the same focused authority she brought to any project that involved upgrading the appearance of something that was already someone else's. I asked what was being delivered. She turned and offered the smile she kept for moments when she needed something to read as perfectly routine. "Camille's treating herself to a proper vanity set," she said, slipping into the third person the way she sometimes did when she was quietly pleased with herself. "Every woman deserves a beautiful space to get ready in." The receipt was on the kitchen counter the following morning, face up, the way receipts are when nobody thinks to flip them over. 9 is $240, paid in full, cash. I stood at that counter for a good while. I ran the arithmetic I hadn't let myself do the evening before when the delivery men were still working the arithmetic, whose answer had already been assembling itself in the back of my mind, while I'd chosen not to look at it directly. $12,000 wired on a Wednesday morning. $9,240 in cash spent on a vanity set by Thursday afternoon. I folded that receipt and tucked it into the front pocket of my work shirt, then went to the dock and kept my mouth shut. That was June of 2022. 4 months on, in October, my grandson Caleb made a discovery of his own. He was 13 by then, working through homework at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, while Camille sat across from him with her eyes on her phone. His own phone was charging in his bedroom, and he needed to pull up a photo his teacher had sent to the family group chat. He asked Camille if he could borrow her phone for a moment to find the image. She passed it over without glancing up from whatever she was reading. Caleb found the photo. He was about to hand the phone back when his thumb went the wrong way across the screen and the contacts list opened. He told me later he hadn't been looking for anything. He wasn't suspicious yet, not the way he later became. He was just a boy who had landed on the wrong screen by accident and found himself staring at something that didn't add up. He saw my name in that list. His grandfather, Leonard Garrett, the man who'd shown him how to read a fish scale and let him pick which crab to set in the display case on Saturday mornings. The name Camille had saved for me was Fish Smell. He scrolled one entry up and found his grandmother, Dolores Garrett, the woman who kept butterscotch candies in her cardigan pocket and called him her best boy every single time she laid eyes on him. Camille had saved her as Old Nog. Caleb set the phone on the table face down. His chest went tight in a way he would describe to me much later as the feeling of understanding something you wished you could ununderstand. He said nothing to Camille. He picked up his pencil and returned to his homework and sat at that table for another 40 minutes, completing his assignment with the steady focus of a boy who had learned something that mattered and wasn't ready to let it show. He held on to that screenshot for 8 months before he showed it to a soul. I didn't know any of this at the time. My mind was on $12,000 and a vanity set and a receipt riding in my shirt pocket like a stone I couldn't put down. Then in November, a letter arrived from a financial company I'd never heard of, addressed to me, concerning a consumer loan in my name for $25,000 that was closing in on its third missed payment. I have put my name to a good many things over the years. The mortgage on the house in 1992, sitting across from a loan officer named Clifton, who smelled of menthol cough drops and walked through every page twice, whether you asked him to or not. Audra's birth certificate, my hand trembling slightly because I hadn't slept in 31 hours and the pen felt unwieldy in my grip. The business registration for the fish stall, which I signed on the hood of my truck in the parking lot of the Lincoln County offices because I was too impatient to hunt down a proper surface. I know what my signature looks like. I have been making the same one for nearly 50 years. The one on the loan document was close, but it wasn't mine. I knew at the moment I unfolded that letter and read the account number and the repayment schedule and the name of the lending company, a fintech outfit based in Austin, Texas, that processed consumer loans entirely online with no in-person verification required. The loan had been taken out in September of 2022. The fund's $25,000 had been deposited into an account I didn't recognize. 3 payments had gone unmade. The letter was a formal notice that the account was moving toward collections. I read it, standing at the kitchen counter at 6:00 in the morning, while the rest of the house still slept. Then I folded it back into the envelope, tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and went to the dock. I called Franklin Draper from the truck at 7:45, sitting in the parking lot, behind the market with the engine running and the heater going, because November in Newport gets into your bones if you give it a chance. Franklin Draper had been practicing law in Newport for 33 years, which meant he had witnessed most of what a small coastal city could generate in the way of human behavior, and very little of it caught him off guard anymore. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had played football in college and hadn't entirely let go of that image of himself. He'd been my friend since we both served on the Harbor Advisory Committee in 2007. When I told him what the letter contained, he went quiet long enough that I pulled the phone from my ear to make sure the call was still live. "Bring it to me this afternoon," he said. "Don't say anything to Derek or Camille. Don't touch that account number. Just bring me the letter." I brought him the letter. Franklin spent the next 4 days helping me reach the lender's fraud department, pull my credit reports, and document everything connected to that account. I signed the authorizations allowing the lender to discuss the application with him. On the 5th day, I sat across his desk in his office on Olive Street while he walked me through what we had confirmed. The loan application had been filed online using a scanned copy of my government-issued ID and a digital reproduction of my signature. The lender confirmed the $25,000 had been deposited into an account opened in my name at a bank I had never set foot in. The lender has flagged the account for fraud, Franklin said. They're preserving the records. If you decide to report this formally, those records can be requested through the proper channels. I sat with that for a moment. $25,000 moved in 11 days. My name on the paperwork, my credit doing the heavy lifting, and someone else's hands on the cash. Leonard, Franklin said carefully. I understand what you're telling me, I said. The police. No, I said. Franklin set his pen down. Len, I said. No, Franklin. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me some. He is still my son. I am not sending my son to prison over $25,000. Franklin looked at me the way he looks at clients who are making a decision he can't get behind but understands he won't be able to shift. Then what is it you want? I want him to pay it back, every dollar. No deadlines, no lawyers, no courtrooms, but every dollar. I lifted my jacket from the back of the chair. And if he doesn't, then we have a different conversation. Franklin gave a slow nod. He made a note on his legal pad and set the pen down again. There's something else, he said. He turned his monitor toward me. On the screen was a California Secretary of State business registration page. 3 separate online retail businesses, all registered to a woman named Camille Garrett, all carrying my home address on Agate Beach Drive in Newport. The filings had gone through in August of 2022, 3 months before the loan letter found its way to my door. My home address, my street, my mailbox, which I had walked out to open every morning for 31 years. She's been using your property as her registered business address, Franklin said, without your knowledge or consent that violates California Business and Professions Code. Any customer complaints, any tax correspondence, any regulatory notices go straight to your house. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been sitting at the bottom of everything since I first walked into Franklin's office. Is the house still in my name? Franklin held my gaze. 100%, he said. Yours and Dolores's has been for 31 years. No lien, no transfer document, no power of attorney, nothing. The house is yours, Leonard. Completely and entirely yours. Something in my chest let go that I hadn't known I was clenching. I stood and pulled on my jacket. Keep watching, I told Franklin. Don't move on anything yet. Just keep watching. For how long? I did up the top button the way Dolores had always told me to, in cold weather. Until I know what I'm actually looking at, I said. I drove home along the waterfront with the windows cracked despite the cold, because I needed the salt air and the sound of the water, and that particular quiet that only settles at the edge of the coast when the fog is just beginning to pull back. I didn't tell Dolores that night. I let her sleep. I sat on the back porch until nearly 2 in the morning, listening to the harbor and turning the shape of everything over in my mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand when you're trying to work out what it's made of. Then Audra called. Audra has always been the one who noticed things. She was 9 years old the first time I noticed it. She told me the Hendersons' cat looked different, and 3 days later, the vet diagnosed the animal with something serious. At 16, she knew a boy in her class intended to ask her to prom before the kid had even made up his mind. For years, I'd gently suggest she was borrowing trouble. I don't believe that now. Audra is 36. She pulls the lunch and dinner shift at a place called The Rogue on Bay Boulevard, one of those establishments that has been putting food in front of fishermen and tourists alike since long before my daughter or I drew our first breath. She moves fast, speaks plainly, and carries herself with the no-nonsense efficiency you develop when your livelihood involves hauling heavy plates across a crowded floor. She has Dolores's gift for sensing what a room holds before she sets foot in it. On a Thursday evening in January of 2023, she rang me and her opening words were, "Dad, Camille called me again." I had a cup of coffee sitting beside me on the back porch, cold by then, because my mind had drifted somewhere else entirely. I pulled myself upright. What was she after? Same as before, Audra said. She was asking about the house. Had you and Mom discussed what happens down the road? Was Derek named in the will? The stall came up too. Was retirement on your mind? Would Derek step in, or were you looking to sell? I set that cold cup on the railing and didn't pick it up again. How many times has she called? I asked. Audra took a beat. Going back to January of last year, 7 or 8 times, she said. 7 or 8 times across 12 months, and I had assumed each one would be the last. That is not how a person behaves when they are acting on impulse. That is methodical. That is someone keeping their eyes on a destination and making sure nothing in their manner reveals the route they are taking. Audra, I told her, start at the beginning and leave nothing out. It ran to 40 minutes, and somewhere in that middle stretch, I had risen from my chair and was gripping the cold coffee cup against the porch railing, squeezing it hard enough that Dolores, watching from the kitchen, came to the back door and shaped 3 silent words with her mouth. Are you all right? I gave her the short nod we'd settled on. Not entirely, but I'll explain after the one we'd worked out together sometime in the late 1990s without ever labeling it. When Audra and I finally got off the phone, I didn't go back inside. The bay had gone dark. The running lights from the boats offshore cast little pools of yellow that rippled apart and reformed on the surface of the water. I stood there and turned over the picture of a woman who had telephoned my daughter 7 or 8 times over a full year fishing for information about my property, my livelihood, and my intentions, and who had sat across from me at supper every single night, wearing an expression that said none of it was happening. Camille had been pointing herself at something for a long while. I had sensed that in a loose, formless way for months. But hearing the whole thing unrolled in order, each call, each question, the steady accumulation of it, was something else. A suspicion you can almost talk yourself out of. A pattern laid end to end is a different thing entirely. It had structure. Structure is not easy to dismiss. Then, late March, Audra rang again. Her voice carried a note I knew well. It was the note of someone who has stumbled onto information they weren't hunting for, and is still figuring out what weight to assign it. You remember Renee Colburn? She asked. I turned it over. The family over on Maple Terrace, that one? Right. She became a journalist. Dad. Grew up right here, writes for the Lincoln County Weekly now. She got in touch because she's putting together a story on coastal lifestyle, accounts people who gather followers by building a whole identity around living near the water. She ran across one with roughly 8,000 followers. The account posts photographs of a kitchen she felt certain she'd seen before. Something cold settled in my chest. Our kitchen, I said. Your kitchen, Dad, Audra said, and I heard it. That particular measured evenness she reserves for news she already knows is going to cost me something. The window over the sink, the view of the bay through it, the shelves I put up myself back in 1997, the table where Caleb spreads out his schoolwork, post after post, captioned with language about her coastal home, her beautiful life, the quality of her morning light. She had signed advertising arrangements with a cookware brand, a skincare line, and a home goods retailer. Renee's best estimate was that those partnerships had brought in somewhere around $4,000. $4,000 from pictures of my kitchen. From that window, I hung myself on a Saturday in October of 1997 with a borrowed level and a collection of second-hand tools. What's the name on the account, I asked. Audra told me. I picked up the notepad I keep on the railing. It lives there precisely because certain pieces of information need to be written down the moment they arrive, and I put the name on paper. I looked at what I'd written. Then I called Franklin. Franklin went through the account carefully, the posting history, the partnership disclosures, the full timeline over the course of 2 days. When he reached me with his findings, there was no surprise in his voice, and that was one of the qualities that made Franklin Draper worth having in your corner. He met what was real without needing to perform a reaction. He kept the anger in a separate drawer for later. She started posting in September of 2022, he told me. Consistent output. Your kitchen, the back porch, the view out of the living room. She keeps her face out of the frame. The property gets described as our coastal home. Our, I said. Franklin said yes. Our. I asked whether there was anything more I needed to be aware of. He said he'd keep digging. 3 days on, he called again, and I could hear right away that the register had shifted. Leonard. Derek paid a visit to a colleague of mine 2 weeks back. He wanted to understand how property gets moved between family members, how long the process runs when the owner is elderly and the arrangement is characterized as voluntary. Elderly. I was 68 years old. I had moved 200 LB ice chests without help as recently as the Thursday before. Which colleague, I asked, Franklin told me. Had Derek hired them? No, he put his questions on the table and walked out. My colleague flagged it to Franklin because they go back and because something about the conversation sat wrong with him. I turned toward the bay. The May fog was lifting in that slow, deliberate way it has when the sun finally means business. Franklin. I said Camille's birthday is 3 weeks out. He said he knew. Keep watching. Franklin said. Leonard, I genuinely believe you should. I cut him off. 3 weeks, Franklin, then we'll have the full picture of what we're actually dealing with. A silence followed. Then came the quiet exhale of a man who has run out of arguments against someone he knows too well to keep pushing. I'll keep watching, he said. I was up at 4:00 that morning. Same as every morning. I need you to hold that image because it matters to everything that follows. At 4:00 in the morning, on the 22nd of June 2023, I was standing at Calvin Meade's boat in the dark, flashlight in one hand, insulated gloves on, going through what he'd pulled in overnight and choosing the finest of it. Dungeness crab bay shrimp, 2 whole halibut that weighed nearly 14 libs between them. I loaded everything into my truck on my own, buried it in ice, made the drive home, and put in the next 6 hours in my kitchen, getting food ready for a birthday party, being thrown inside my own house for a woman who had stored my number in her phone under the name Fish Smell. Hold that. Guests started coming through the door at 6:00 that evening, 16 of them, Camille's people, a mix of faces I'd encountered at earlier gatherings and others I'd never laid eyes on. Derek stationed himself near the entrance and collected their coats with the relaxed authority of someone who has decided this house already belongs to him. Camille drifted through the living room, in a black dress, laughing easily, resting a hand on someone's arm, mid-sentence the way people do when they want to be felt as well as heard. She had a warmth to her that evening, that lit-up pulling qualities she could produce when she knew she had an audience. I moved through the room with trays. When the shrimp platter went thin, I replenished it. I brought the crab out and the halibut and a sourdough loaf I'd collected from the bakery on Coast Highway because Camille had sent me a text at 6:45 that morning, adding it to my instructions. A woman standing near the fireplace caught me as I passed and told me the crab was something exceptional and wanted to know its origin. I told her Calvin Meade's boat fresh that same morning. She said she'd have to track down a source for it. I didn't mention that she was standing in the kitchen of the man who could arrange exactly that. At one point during the evening, Camille drifted to a stop beside me near the kitchen doorway and addressed a cluster of her friends in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough. Derek's dad works down at the fish market. At least tonight he's making himself useful. 2 of the women produced polite smiles. A third glanced at me and then quickly looked somewhere else, the way people redirect their gaze from something that makes them uneasy. Dolores was seated at the far end of the table in the green dress she kept for moments when she needed to feel like herself. Her hands rested in her lap. Her spine was straight. She was taking everything in with the settled stillness of a woman who has concluded that holding herself together is the most powerful statement she can make in a room. Caleb had folded himself into a chair near the fireplace, legs tucked under him, phone in both hands. He'd barely spoken all night. Once across the room, his eyes found mine, and I gave him the small nod that meant I see it too. He returned one that meant I know. After the main food had been out for an hour after the guests had eaten, and the wine had gone around twice, and the birthday cake had come out and been sung over, I pulled out the chair beside Dolores and lowered myself into it. My feet were throbbing from the tile floor. My lower back had been filing formal complaints since 2 in the afternoon. I had been standing for 14 hours, and I wanted to sit next to my wife and eat the meal I had cooked in a house I had held the deed to for 31 years. Camille materialized at the edge of the table. "That pile in the sink isn't going to wash itself," she said. Her tone was pleasant, conversational, the kind of voice that packages a humiliation as a perfectly sensible remark. I rose back to my full height, unhurried. I looked at the sink stacked with pots and cutting boards from 6 hours of work, and then I looked at her. "I've been on my feet since 4 this morning, Camille," I said. "I'm going to eat first." Something shifted across her face. Not quite anger, something colder than anger, something that had been lying in wait for precisely this occasion. She reached out across the table. The bowl of drawn butter went over the edge and hit the hardwood floor in a wide yellow splash that fanned across Dolores's shoes and up the hem of her green dress. All 16 people in the room went still. Camille reached down, pulled the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and dropped it at my feet. "Then get down there and clean it up," she said. Dolores pushed her chair back. "Camille, that is enough. You sit down and stay out of this." The words landed on Dolores like a blow. My wife's hands came up and gripped the table's edge. Her knuckles whitened, her chin lifted. Tears rose in her eyes that she was absolutely determined not to let fall. I stepped forward. What came out of me came from somewhere deep below my ribs. a place where pressure had been accumulating for 3 years. "You will not speak to my wife that way," I said. "Not in this room, not in this house, not anywhere." Camille set her wineglass on the table. She moved toward me, and the room seemed to draw in around the two of us the way it does when something is about to happen that no one will be able to walk back. Across the room, I could see guests beginning to rise from their chairs. A man near the kitchen doorway reached out a hand toward his wife. Nobody moved in time. Her right hand swung back, and the first blow caught my left cheek with a crack that cut through every other sound in the room. Then the second. "You are nothing but a filthy, stinking piece of trash," she said, her voice low and steady and carrying no trace of shame. "My husband deserves a real father." Derek's hands closed around both my arms from behind, pinning them back. His grip was practiced and sure, not the grab of a man reacting. He had placed himself there before she swung. "Take your mother and your garbage and get out of our house, Dad." His tone was level-measured, the voice of a man running a script he had rehearsed. I didn't move. I looked at the butter pooled on the floor. I looked at Dolores standing now, both palms pressed flat to the table, tears moving freely down her face, chin, still raised eyes, still burning. I looked at Caleb in the corner, on his feet, now his face drained to the color of chalk, phone clutched to his chest, gaze moving between me and his father, with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. The expression of a boy watching the floor drop out from under everything he believed was solid. I looked at 16 people who had not moved. "Let go of my arms, Derek," I said. He let go. I crossed to Dolores and took her hand in both of mine and felt her fingers lock around mine so hard it hurt. I was grateful for the hurt. It meant she was here on her feet still herself. "Let's go, Dolores," I said. "We're leaving." We moved through the kitchen past the food I had hauled up from the dock before the sun rose past the guests who stepped aside without a word, and out through the front door of the house on Agate Beach Drive that I had owned since 1992. The night air off Depot Bay was cold and sharp, and it met my face like something I had earned. Dolores was trembling at my side, her whole body shaking, and I got my arm around her shoulder and walked her to the truck and opened her door and helped her in. I went around to my side. I sat behind the wheel. I put both hands on it and looked straight ahead at the house with the lights still on and the music still going, and I didn't start the engine. My phone buzzed. Franklin Draper. Leonard. They just found out," he said. "Audra lives 12 minutes from the house on Agate Beach Drive, a small bungalow on Nuna Street she has rented for 9 years, and made her own with the particular organized clutter of someone who works hard and reads constantly, and doesn't lose sleep over what guests might think of her bookshelves. When Dolores and I pulled into her driveway at 9 that evening, every light inside was already burning. She had been waiting. She came through the front door before I had finished parking still, in her restaurant clothes and her work shoes, and she walked straight down the porch steps and wrapped both arms around her mother without a word. Dolores buried her face in Audra's shoulder, and her whole body shook with everything she had been holding in place for the past 3 hours. I stood beside them on the driveway, with one hand resting on Dolores's back, and let her shake. When Dolores finally steadied, Audra looked at me over her mother's shoulder. Her eyes were red. Her jaw was set. "Come inside," she said. I made coffee. The coffee was strong and tasted like the bottom of a pot left too long on the burner, and it was exactly right. I sat at Audra's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug, still wearing my jacket because it hadn't occurred to me to take it off. I put Franklin's call on speaker so Audra could hear. "They worked it out about 40 minutes ago," Franklin said. "Camille found the deed in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. She went looking after a guest asked Derek something about the property at the party, and Derek said something careless. She pulled the deed and saw both your names on it, and she understood immediately what that meant." "How do you know this?" Audra asked. "Because Derek called my colleague at 9:15 tonight in a panic, asking whether a property deed could be contested on the basis of an implied verbal agreement. My colleague rang me straight away. I stared into the surface of the coffee in my mug. An implied verbal agreement. Derek had been telling Camille that I had promised him the house verbally, Franklin said. By all appearances, he had been saying it for the better part of 2 years. She had been operating on the belief that the house was already effectively theirs. When she saw both names on the deed with no transfer paperwork of any kind, she realized that whatever Derek had been describing to her had no existence on paper. Because it has no existence on paper, Leonard. It never did. The house is yours, 100% yours and Dolores's. A verbal promise involving real property carries no legal weight without a written agreement. What I'm about to share is something I didn't see coming, and once I heard it, there was no way to unhear it. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait and let the truth do the work on its own time? Neither Derek nor Camille has any legal ground to stand on when it comes to that house. Dolores had moved to the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, and the look on her face was one I hadn't seen since the morning 30 years ago when I came home and told her the bank had said yes, and we were going to own a piece of this earth. "Leonard," she said barely above a whisper. "She threw us out of our own house." "She did," I said. "And she didn't know." "She had no idea," I said. Dolores pulled out a chair across from mine and sat down heavily, pressing both palms to the tabletop and staring at them. Then her eyes came up bright and searching. Derek had been telling her it was already theirs. Yes, he lied to her. Yes. She sat with that. Audra settled in beside her and covered her mother's hand with her own, and the three of us held a silence, the kind that falls when the thing in front of you has too many layers to begin untangling at once. Then Audra turned to me. "Dad," she said, "did you already know I put my mug down?" Franklin had reached me 3 days before the party. Derek had turned up at Franklin's colleague's office on a Thursday afternoon and stayed for 40 minutes walking through scenarios for how a family home gets transferred, when the owner is getting on in years and the move is framed as something voluntary and mutually agreed upon. He wanted to know how long the paperwork runs. He wanted to know if both owners had to be in the room. He wanted to know what happens when one owner is, and here he had used his own words, not fully engaged in the process. Not fully engaged. I had been fully engaged in every process of my life since the age of 17, when I started hauling myself out of bed at 4 in the morning to earn a place in the world. Franklin had walked me through all of it on a Saturday morning at a picnic table outside the coffee shop on Bay Boulevard, voice-low gaze fixed on his cup. Don't put your name on anything, he said. A form, a card, a scrap of paper, nothing. Watch, wait, and call him the moment anything shifted. Why didn't you say something to me? There was no heat in Dolores's voice. It was the tone she uses when she genuinely needs to understand, which is an entirely different register. And if I'm honest, a harder one to face. I studied her face. The flush from crying still hadn't left her cheek. There was a faint mascara smudge below her left eye that she didn't know about. I held off because the timing wasn't right, I told her, because you would have cried, and I couldn't let you carry that into the party. I needed Camille to read the room as a completely ordinary evening. I had to see what move she would make when she believed everything was falling into place for her. Dolores kept her eyes on me for a long moment. "That's a terrible reason," she said. "I know," I said. "You should have told me." "I know that too," I said. Audra got up and topped off all 3 mugs without a word, a thing she has done since she was tall enough to reach the pot, and which has always been her quiet way of saying she's staying. Franklin's voice came through the speaker again. "Leonard, there's one more thing." Derek rang my colleague a second time, 9:45. He'd collected himself by then. One question specific. What question, I said. He asked whether a property owner who refused to go along with a voluntary transfer could be subject to a guardianship or conservatorship, filing on the grounds of diminished capacity. The room stopped. Audra's hand went still against her mug. Dolores raised her eyes to mine, and something moved into her expression that I hadn't seen there before. Not fear exactly, something that sits beneath fear, older and quieter. The look of a woman who has just taken the full measure of how far someone was prepared to go. "Franklin," I said, "go get some rest. We'll pick this up in the morning." I hung up. Sitting across from my wife and my daughter in Audra's kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, I turned over the picture of a man who had pinned my arms behind my back while his wife hit me, and then 2 hours later had been on the phone with a lawyer exploring how to have my right to manage my own affairs taken away. "Tomorrow," I said. "That's when we begin." I got 4 hours on Audra's couch, and my eyes opened at 3:58 in the morning, near enough to my usual time that my body filed no complaint. Dolores was in Audra's guest room. Through the door left open a crack, I could hear the slow, even rhythm of her breathing, the breathing of a woman who had wept herself into the kind of sleep that is just deep enough to stay ahead of everything waiting on the other side. I stood in that hallway and listened and felt something shift inside my chest that I've never found the right word for. It was grief and gratitude braided together, which shouldn't make sense and which I have found over a long life to be among the feelings a person knows best when they have loved someone across many years. I found a grocery receipt on Audra's kitchen counter and wrote on the back of it, "Gone to the market back by noon. Don't let your mother fret." Then I was in the truck heading for the dock in the dark. Calvin Meade was already working when I pulled into the lot, him and two deckhands moving a catch of rock cod and Pacific halibut off the boat. He looked up and saw me crossing the parking lot, and he stopped and held that look for a beat, the way one man reads another when he can tell something has happened, and he's deciding whether to ask about it. "Len," he said. "Calvin," I said. "What did you bring in?" He held my gaze one more second, then he went back to the crates. "Good halibut, some rock cod, a few pounds of spot prawns." "Take it all," I said. Neither of us said a word about the night before. Calvin is the kind of man who grasps that there are mornings when the lifting is the only conversation that's needed, and that showing up with a crate for your friend to carry is worth more than any string of words. The stall was open by 4:45. Loretta showed up at 5:10, right on her usual schedule, and paused in the aisle between our stalls. She looked at me the same way she had back in March when she'd told me I resembled a man lugging somebody else's belongings up a very long staircase. This time she kept whatever she was thinking to herself. She just reached across the partition, set her hand on my forearm for a moment, and then turned back to laying out her produce. It was exactly the right thing, and she knew it. By 7, the market had filled regulars and out-of-towners moving through together. The couple from Yashat's retired, who never missed a Sunday, and never agreed on how to cook the spot prawns, even though they'd been buying them for years. I ran the counter, weighed the fish, made change, fielded the usual questions about what was freshest and whether the halibut would hold up for ceviche. It would. At 7:12, Derek came through the main entrance. His hands were in his pockets, and his eyes swept the room with the careful, practiced air of someone who wants to look unhurried and is not quite pulling it off. The jacket he had on was his work jacket, which meant he hadn't gone home, which meant he hadn't slept. He crossed to my stall and came to a stop at the counter. We looked at each other. Then his hand moved toward the nearest crate, the rock code, with the easy reach of a man who has been taking from someone else's stock long enough that the gesture has become second nature. "That'll be $48, Derek," I said. His hand came back. His eyes found mine. "Dad," for the rock cod, I said. "Halibut runs $62 a pound today." His jaw pulled tight. "I'm not a customer here." I reached under the counter, brought out my receipt book, opened it to a clean page, and set my pen on it. "Tell me what you're after," I said, "and I'll get it written up." "Dad." His voice broke on that word, just a hairline fracture, just enough to show me there was something running beneath the surface that his composure wasn't quite covering. "I'm your son." I looked up from the receipt book. I looked at my son across the fish counter in the market where I had worked since before he drew his first breath. And I said what had been sitting in me since the moment his hands locked around my arms the night before. That night, I was also your father. He held my gaze. His throat moved. The retired couple from Yakats stood 2 feet away with the frozen stillness of people who have blundered into someone else's private reckoning and can't find a polite way out. Derek put $48 on the counter in cash. He left the rock cod where it sat. He walked back out through the main entrance without a single glance behind him. Loretta was at my elbow 30 seconds after that, with a coffee from the cart near the door. She set it beside the receipt book, said nothing, and stepped away. I drank it standing up hot strong, exactly what the moment called for. By 10 Zojer, Audra was at my stall. She had a manila folder so thick, the edges of the documents inside were creeping out past the flap, and she wore the expression she gets when she's been deep in something for hours and has arrived at conclusions. She laid the folder on the counter between us. "I've been pulling records since 6 this morning," she said. "Bank statements, utility bills, property tax receipts, insurance payments. 3 years of them, Dad." I dried my hands on my apron and opened it. The first document was a savings account statement with a column of automatic withdrawals marked in yellow: electricity, gas, water, internet, Lincoln County property tax installments, homeowners insurance. Month after month across 3 years, all of it drawing from my account. Audra had totaled the figure at the bottom of the first page in her careful handwriting. $31.412. "That's what you spent keeping that house running while they lived there," she said. I went back through Derek and Camille's contributions. They put money in during 4 of the 36 months. The other 32 months they covered nothing. I sat with that number, 31,412. She told people we were a burden to them. I know Dad. She told her social circle we were elderly dependents who couldn't carry our own weight. I know. I closed the folder. The market moved on around us the way it always does, cheerful, unhurried, indifferent to whatever was happening at my particular counter. Somewhere near the entrance, a child laughed a sharp, bright sound that climbed all the way up to the warehouse ceiling. I passed the folder back to Audra. "Keep this somewhere safe," I said. "There's more, isn't there?" Audra met my eyes without flinching. "There's more, Dad. I have always run loose records at the stall. Not from sloppiness. I know every supplier on this dock, by name, know what each boat brings in as the seasons turn. Know my inventory the way. You know the layout of a house you've lived in for decades. Ask me on a Tuesday morning in November how many pounds of Dungeness crab I moved the week before, what I paid Calvin for it, what margin I made, off the tourist trade versus my regulars. I can tell you without looking anything up. What I never tracked, what it genuinely never occurred to me to track, was what walked out the back in the hands of a woman who had persuaded me she was family." Audra spread a second set of documents on the counter once the lunch rush had thinned, and Loretta had quietly taken over, watching my stall for 20 minutes, doing it without being asked and without making it feel like a favor, which is exactly what distinguishes a real friend from a kind acquaintance. The documents were printouts, marketplace listings, neighborhood group posts, screenshots from 3 different local forums serving Newport and the surrounding area. Audra had sorted them by date, oldest to most recent spanning 11 months. The account name was fresh from the bay. The listings were detailed and presented professionally. Dungeness crab, Pacific halibut spot, prawns Depot Bay, squid, rock cod. Prices set at roughly double what I charged at the stall. Pickup available from a residential address. Until 72 hours earlier, that had been my address. The seller described the product as sourced directly from local fishing boats through a family operation with over 3 decades of experience. 3 decades of experience. My 3 decades. My standing relationships with Calvin and the other captains. My eye for what was worth buying and what wasn't. Knowledge Camille never had to develop herself, because she had simply dispatched Derek to ask me which crates were worth taking, and then dispatched Derek to carry them home. I stood at that counter and read through 11 months of listings, and what I felt wasn't quite what I'd expected. It wasn't raw anger. It was something more precise than anger. The sensation of finally understanding in full, in exact detail, the specific and deliberate shape of what had been constructed around me. Not the rough outline. The architecture. Audra was watching me, arms folded, chin down, the stance she takes when she is waiting for something hard to arrive. How much, I asked. Conservative estimate based on what I could find. $18,740, she said. There may be transactions that didn't show up in my search. $18,740. Sold under the name of my family's work, my boats, my dock, my 35 years of 4 o'clock mornings. She called it a family operation. Yes, I said. And she told everyone at every dinner that the smell of the market turned her stomach. Yes, Dad. Audra said, her voice measured and steady and quietly burning. She did. Loretta appeared at the partition between our stalls. She had a particular look, the look of someone who has been sitting on a piece of information and has decided she's held it long enough. "Len," she said, "there's something I ought to have brought up before now." I turned toward her. Starting about a year ago, maybe a bit longer, customers began stopping at my stall, asking about seafood, not produced seafood. They'd have confirmation messages on their phones from an account called Fresh from the Bay, and the pickup address matched yours, but they'd wander over to me by mistake because of how our stalls are positioned. She paused. I told them they had the wrong place. I figured you'd set up some sort of separate online operation and just hadn't mentioned it to me. I should have said something. You had no way of knowing, I said. No, she said, but I should have asked. I thanked her, and she went back to her side, and I stood at my counter thinking about those customers. People who had come to Loretta by mistake, looking for seafood, ordered through an account that ran on my dock, my suppliers, my reputation, and my home address. While the woman operating that account stood in my kitchen complaining about the way fish smelled on my jacket. Calvin Meade came by the stall at 2:30. He'd finished his offloading and had the easy, unhurried look of a man with a window between jobs, which, with Calvin, usually signals he's carrying something he's been deciding whether to say out loud. He leaned against the counter. "Heard Derek came by this morning." He did, I said. Calvin looked down at his hands for a moment. Len, I want to get something to you before it reaches you another way. I waited. Derek has been turning up at the dock early, not alongside you on his own, before you arrive, maybe once a week, for the past several months. He talks to the captains. He told Hank Oberg he'd be taking over the operation before long, and wanted to start laying the groundwork with the right people. He said something along the same lines to me back in April. I thought he was getting out ahead of a handoff you two had discussed, being proactive about a transition. Calvin looked up at me. Then I started noticing which crates he was pulling. Something cold dropped through the center of my chest. He was picking the best of what came in. Calvin went on, his voice easing down a register, not from embarrassment, but from the particular care a man uses when he's delivering something he knows is going to leave a mark. Not the seconds or the overflow, the prime crates, the ones you'd set aside for the premium counter. He loaded them into his truck and left. Calvin saw it happen at least 6 or 7 times himself. I looked at Calvin Meade, who had been selling me fish for 22 years and had never once in that stretch said anything that wasn't true. He thought it was already his, I said. Calvin gave a slow nod. That's what it looked like from where I stood. I turned and faced the harbor. The afternoon light was striking the water at the angle Dolores calls the golden hour, that 20-minute window, when the whole world looks like the finest version of itself. The boats were moving in the easy, unhurried way they move when the weather cooperates and the catch has been good. It is one of the most beautiful harbors on the California coast. I had been watching it from that very spot for 35 years. Derek had looked at all of it and seen something he could take. I turned back to Calvin. Thank you, I said, for telling me. Calvin pushed off the counter. What are you going to do? I gathered the printouts Audra had left and squared the stack against the countertop the way you square a deck before you put it away. Audra found something else, I said. A document Camille left on the coffee table. Calvin raised his eyebrows. Come back tomorrow morning, I said. I'll tell you then. I have held a great deal of paper over the course of my life. Fishing licenses renewed every year since I was 23. The mortgage document that Clifton, the loan officer, walked me through twice at a table that smelled of burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. Audra's birth certificate. Derek's. The deed to the house on Agate Beach Drive, which I signed on a Wednesday afternoon in November of 1992, and which has carried my name and Dolores's name every single day since. I know what important paper feels like. There is a particular weight to it, not the physical kind, but the other kind, the kind that comes from knowing that what you are holding has the power to alter something real. The folder Audra set on the kitchen table that evening carried that weight. She had come across it 2 days after the party when she went back to the house on Agate Beach Drive to collect some of Dolores's medications and the cardigan she had left hanging on the hook by the back door. Derek and Camille were out. Audra used the key Dolores kept on her own ring, a key, as Audra pointed out to me later, to a house that belonged to her parents, and therefore one she had every right to use. The folder had been sitting on the living room coffee table in plain sight, resting on top of a stack of home decorating magazines. The cover page read, Garrett Coastal Seafood, in a typeface chosen to look established and authoritative. Audra had picked it up, read the first 2 pages, and brought it with her. She slid it across the table to me now. I opened it. The opening page was a business overview. The concept, as Camille had written it, was to formalize and expand what she described as the existing family seafood operation into a branded coastal lifestyle business, online, retail fish sales, ordering and catering for private events, and a social media presence, which I now understood was already well underway. The market positioning section described the business as having access to exclusive supplier relationships built across 3 decades, which was a polished way of saying that Calvin Meade and the other captains on that dock returned my calls because I had been buying their catch honestly and paying on time since before some of them had their licenses. The second page was the organizational structure. Derek Garrett, owner and chief executive. Camille Garrett, general manager and brand director. I turned to the third page. Leonard Garrett, part-time counter assistant. I read that line twice. I read it the way you read something when the words are plain and your mind is working correctly, but some deeper part of you keeps insisting that the meaning cannot be what it appears, that surely you have misread it, that there must be another angle from which it resolves into something less. There was no other angle. Part-time counter assistant in a business built on my name, my dock, my suppliers, my 35 years of 4 o'clock mornings. My standing with every captain buyer and regular customer between Newport and Astoria, part-time counter assistant. Dolores was sitting across from me. She had been reading over my shoulder as I worked through the pages, and when I reached the third page, she stretched out her hand and pressed her finger against that line, as if she were pinning it down. "Part-time," she said. Her voice was perfectly flat, which with Dolores means the opposite of what a flat voice usually signals. It means she has moved beyond the place where volume serves any purpose. "Counter assistant?" "Yes," I said. She lifted her finger from the page. She settled back in her chair, looked up at the ceiling, and I could see the muscles in her jaw, working the way they do, when she is trying to make sense of something that runs against everything she believes about how people ought to behave. "Leonard," she said finally, "you taught Derek to read a fish scale when he was 6 years old. I know. He would perch on top of an ice chest and pepper you with questions for hours at a stretch. I remember. He believed this was going to be his." "Yes," I said. "He did. And in his plan," she said, tapping the folder once with her finger, "you were slated to be the part-time counter assistant." I closed the folder. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and a faint sound from the guest room that suggested Caleb was still awake and perhaps listening, which was fine by me. Caleb had been paying close attention to things for longer than any of us had understood. Audra stood at the counter with her coffee mug held in both hands, watching me with the focused attention she brings to moments when she is weighing whether her father is about to do something that will require her to step in. I was not. I was simply sitting at my daughter's kitchen table at 8 o'clock in the evening, holding a business plan drawn up around my fish stall, grasping with complete clarity that I had spent 3 years handing things to people who had been cataloging them for redistribution. I looked again at the cover page. Garrett Coastal Seafood. They had kept my name. They had kept the name I built and maintained and made worth trusting over 35 years, because a name like that carries value. And things that carry value are worth keeping even when you have decided that the man the name belongs to rates nothing more than a part-time spot behind his own counter. Dad, Audra said, her voice low. I looked up. Her eyes were reddened at the edges and her mouth was set in a tight line. She was gripping the mug the way she grips things when she is furious and working to stay useful. "There's one more thing tonight," she said. She reached into her jacket pocket and held her phone out toward me. On the screen was a text from Caleb sent about an hour earlier. It read, "Aunt Audra, I need to show Dad something, but I think Grandpa should see it first." I looked at the message. Then I looked at Audra. Then I looked toward the hallway leading to the guest room where my grandson had been lying awake for the past hour in the particular sleeplessness of a 14-year-old, carrying something too heavy to set down and too important to keep holding alone. I pushed back from the table. "I'll go talk to him," I said. Caleb was sitting up in bed with his back against the headboard and his knees drawn to his chest. When I knocked and eased the door open, the lamp on the nightstand was on. His phone was face down on the blanket beside him, and when he looked up, his eyes were the eyes of a boy who has not slept and has been turning over how to start a conversation he knows is going to be one of the hardest he has ever had. I pulled the chair from the corner and brought it alongside the bed and sat down. My knees ached from the day. My back was making the complaints it makes after 16 hours on my feet. I said nothing about either. "Your aunt said you wanted to talk," I said. Caleb looked down at his hands. 14 years old. And he already carried his father's frame across his shoulders, his grandmother's eyes in his face, and this quality of going completely motionless when something was working through his mind. It put me in mind of myself, at that same age, a resemblance I found both tender and, if I'm honest, a little unnerving. "Grandpa," he said, "there's something I've been sitting with since the night of that party. I can't keep holding it alone." "Let me see it," I told him. He reached for the phone. His hands had a tremor in them. He flipped it over, pulled up the video, and angled the screen my way. Someone had filmed from the living room corner, close to the fireplace, the camera low, tucked against a chest, the lens just barely peeking above a jacket's edge. Whoever held it had stayed seated and stayed quiet. The picture was more than adequate. Everything in it was legible. I watched myself cross the room with the shrimp platter. I watched Camille plant herself between me and my seat. I watched the drawn butter bowl leave the table in a long arc and heard the crack it made against the floor. On the recording, that sound was thinner than it had been in the room, smaller somehow than what I remembered feeling. I watched Dolores come up out of her chair. I heard my own voice steady. "You will not speak to my wife that way." Then Camille moved toward me, and my son slipped out from the kitchen doorway and positioned himself at my back, unhurried, deliberate, the movements of someone who had thought this through in advance. His hands locked around my arms. Then the first impact, then the second, and Camille spoke each syllable distinct on that recording. Nothing blurred, nothing that could be called ambiguous in the tone of someone who had never once questioned her right to say such things. Then Derek's voice, "Take your mother and your garbage and get out of our house, Dad." I watched myself go still. Then I watched myself move toward Dolores. I watched the two of us go out the door. When the video finished, I stayed where I was, the phone lying in my palm, not ready to put it down. Caleb sat across from me with his jaw clenched and both hands pressed flat to his thighs, and I could read in every taut muscle of his face what the past 4 days had cost him. 14 years old, having witnessed what was done to his grandfather and having kept the footage to himself the whole time, telling nobody. "Caleb," I said. "Grandpa, I'm sorry." The last syllable cracked, and he pulled his lips tight and tipped his head toward the ceiling and blinked once, twice, 3 times hard. "I'm sorry I didn't move. I just sat there with the camera and let it happen and didn't stop any of it," he said. He met my eyes. "You were 14 years old surrounded by adults," I said. "What you did was exactly right. You held on to that record. You protected it. That called for more courage than you're giving yourself credit for." His chin shook with the effort of keeping still. He covered his face with both hands and pulled in a breath, uneven, coming in, steadier going, out the precise kind of breath a person draws when they have decided to stay standing, and one I knew well, because I had drawn it more than once myself, across those 4 days. "Dad's been telling people you threw the first punch," he said, lowering his hands. He told Grandma's sister and Uncle Hank and at least 3 other people I caught him talking to. "Said you'd been drinking that, you went at Mom that he had to step in and pull you off her." Something that had been sharpening in me since that morning at the market found its finest edge. "And what's your read on that?" I asked. Caleb held my gaze without flinching. "My phone doesn't lie." I gave him the phone back. He took it in both hands and studied it, with a gravity that hadn't been there when he first pulled it out. The look of someone who understands that an object has grown heavier than it started. Dolores stepped into the doorway. She'd been in the hall long enough to catch what mattered. I could see it in the line of her shoulders, that particular drop they take when she has moved through the shock of something and arrived at the part where she figures out what to do. She walked in and settled on the bed's edge next to Caleb and drew him under her arm. He went to her the way he had when he was very small. No hesitation, no self-consciousness. The pure, instinctive lean of a child who has never had reason to doubt that shelter is there. She looked across at me. "Derek was using my name," she said, no question in it. "Tell me," I said, so she did. For 3 years, every time Dolores had said to Derek, quietly and privately, that his father needed to rest, that the living arrangement had stretched past its natural end, that the two of them should find a place of their own and let Leonard step back, Derek had carried a different version back to me. "Mom wants the family under one roof. Dad, Mom says she'd be up all night worrying if we left. Mom told me the house feels safer with us here." He had flipped her words end for end and returned them to me as an argument for patience, and I had taken that argument every single time because she was my wife, and what he told me about her, I believed she said. Dolores's jaw went tight. "I told him 17 times, Leonard. I kept count." Caleb pulled back and looked at her. "You kept count." "Naturally I kept count," she said in the tone she reserves for questions whose answers she considers self-evident. Caleb looked over at me, his expression hovering somewhere between sorrow and the ghost of something that might, under other circumstances, have become a smile. I leaned across and rested my hand on his shoulder. There was a solidity to him, the kind that settles into young men as they grow toward who they'll be. I let myself feel that for a moment because it was real and good and right here, and the past week had offered very little of any of those things. "Grandpa," he said low and quiet, "I want to stay here with you and Grandma, not at Mom and Dad's here or wherever you end up going." I looked at my grandson. Then I looked at Dolores, a small nod from her. "We'll work it out," I said. "But tomorrow morning, your father is coming to this house, and you're going to show him exactly what you showed me." Caleb's posture changed. His shoulders settled back and squared. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." I got up and moved the chair back against the wall. "Get some rest, Caleb." He stretched out against the pillow, still holding the phone. "Grandpa," he said just as I got to the door. I stopped and turned back. I've had that video since the night it happened, he said. Good night, son. Derek pulled into Audra's driveway at 8:00 the following morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the sound of his truck reached me, the same engine note I'd been listening to for 20 years. I stood at the counter while it idled, then went quiet. A door, footsteps crossing the porch. 3 knocks measured and deliberate, the knock of a man who spent the drive over composing himself and is now counting on that composure to hold, Audra answered. I heard her speak his name in the careful level tone she uses when she is managing civility. She doesn't feel something she's been capable of since around age 12, and which lands with more weight than raising her voice ever would. Derek came through to the kitchen. He had dressed in work things, not the warehouse jacket, but something older jeans and a flannel I recognized from years back, and that told me enough about how the previous night had gone without him having to say a word. He hadn't shaved. His eyes belonged to a man who had spent the night in a house that had stopped being his and was beginning to understand, in a way that was probably new to him, what that truly felt like. He looked at me. "Dad!" he said. "Sit down, Derek," I said. He pulled out a chair. I filled a second mug and set it on the table without making it a question. Force of habit. He circled it with both hands the way Garrett men have always done, with something warm. And I noticed that, and it turned something in my chest that I had no room for just then, and I let it go. Caleb came through from the hallway. He was dressed and groomed, carrying his phone in his right hand, with the kind of intentionality that belongs to someone who knows precisely what they mean to do with it. He looked at his father. Derek looked back at his son. Something moved between them in that exchange, something old and private, and I didn't need to understand it because it wasn't mine to read. Caleb placed the phone on the table in front of Derek, screen facing up, video ready. "I need you to watch something, Dad," he said. His voice didn't waver. It had the steadiness of someone who lay awake deciding to be steady, which is a different thing from steadiness that comes naturally, but in some ways takes more out of a person to arrive at and is more worth admiring for it. Derek looked at the phone. Then he looked at Caleb. Then his eyes came to me. "Watch it," I said. He watched it. He didn't move while it played. His hands stayed wrapped around the coffee mug, his gaze fixed on the screen. The only shift in his face was something happening around his jaw, a tightening that set in around 30 seconds through and never released. When the video ended, he placed the phone down with care and looked at the table. Caleb's voice was quiet and precise. "You told Uncle Hank I swung at Mom first. You told Grandma's sister I was drunk." He let that sit a moment. "That's not what the video shows, Dad." Derek's throat moved. He looked up at his son, and whatever he had walked in prepared to say whatever account of events he had been assembling through the night, it was gone. His son was 14 years old, looking at him with clear, steady eyes, and a phone holding an unedited record of exactly what had taken place, and there was nothing left to rearrange. "Caleb," he started. "I haven't deleted it," Caleb said, "and I'm not going to." Derek closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at me. "Dad, I want to explain." "Audra," I said. She came in from the living room, where she had been waiting with the folder and the envelope and the particular patience of a woman who has done her preparation and is willing to let the facts carry the weight. She set the manila folder on the table. Derek looked at it. She set the business plan on top of it. He looked at that too. Then she reached inside her jacket and laid a white envelope on the pile. Derek stared at the envelope. His name was written across the front in my hand. I prepared that in May. I said before the party, before Franklin called me about Derek's visit to his colleague's office. I had been working toward it for longer than that, but May was when I committed it to paper and handed it to Audra to keep. Derek looked at the envelope without reaching for it. "Open it," Audra said. He opened it. He drew out 3 pages and read through them, the way a person reads when each line is landing harder than the one before it. The first page was the transfer timeline. The second was the supplier contact list, every captain on the dock, every wholesale buyer, every restaurant account I had spent 35 years building. The third was a letter I had written to him directly, 2 paragraphs about what I had hoped the stall would grow into, under his care, and what I believed he was capable of if he chose to take it seriously. He went through all 3. Then he set them on the table, pressed both palms flat against the surface, and stared at them. "You were going to hand me everything," he said. "Yes," I said. "The whole operation." "Before the party." "Yes, Derek, before any of this." He sat with that for a long moment. His throat worked. His eyes had a brightness in them, that had nothing to do with composure, and I watched him struggle with it, and I kept my eyes on him because I didn't think looking away would do either of us any good. "What happened to it?" he asked. The question came out smaller than he meant it to. I looked at my son across the kitchen table in my daughter's house and said the thing that was truest and most painful and most necessary of anything I had said in the entire previous week. "You did, Derek," I said. "You happened to it." The room held that. Caleb was standing at the counter with his arms folded and his eyes on his father, not crying, not angry the way teenagers go, angry with their whole bodies and all the volume they can find. He was sad in the way of someone old enough to grasp what's been lost, but young enough to feel that loss straight through without the protective distance that adults spend years acquiring against exactly this kind of moment. Derek looked at his son. Caleb held his gaze. "I'm going to stay with Grandpa and Grandma," he said, "for a while." Derek nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't have the standing to argue. And I think some part of him knew that the only thing available to him in that kitchen on that morning was to absorb what was true, let his son go, and not make it any heavier than it already was. He pushed back from the table and stood. He picked up the 3 pages, folded them carefully, and tucked them into his shirt pocket, which surprised me. "Can I keep these?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment. "Yes," I said. He nodded. He looked at Caleb one more time, a look that held everything he couldn't put into words in that kitchen on that morning. Then he walked back through the house and out the front door, and I listened to his truck turn over in the driveway and back away down the street. Caleb watched the window until the sound was gone. Then he turned to me. "What happens now, Grandpa?" I picked up my coffee. "Now," I said, "I go change the locks." A locksmith named Stuart came by on a Tuesday morning. He was maybe 32, 33 with sawdust on his boots and a keyring clipped to his belt, holding more keys than I had ever owned in my life. He pulled up in a white van with the company name stenciled along the side. In blue letters, came to the door, shook my hand, and asked no questions at all about why I needed every lock in the house replaced. I was grateful for that. There are moments in a life when the most useful thing another person can offer is to show up with the right tools, do the work, and require nothing in the way of explanation. Stuart was precisely that kind of person. He started with the front door. Dolores sat in the armchair by the living room window while he worked drinking tea and holding a book she hadn't turned a page of in 45 minutes. Caleb was at the kitchen table working through summer homework, with the focused industry of a boy who has decided that returning to ordinary things is the correct response to extraordinary circumstances, a decision I respected enormously. I walked through the house as Stuart moved from door to door, looking at the rooms the way you look at them when you return after an absence and start noticing what familiarity had long since made invisible. The gray linen curtains Camille had hung in the front bedroom were still in the window. I took them down, folded them, and set them by the front door. Dolores's white cotton curtains were in a box in the hall closet. She had put them there after Camille replaced them because Dolores is the kind of woman who keeps things against the day they might be needed. I carried them back to the window and hung them. They were creased from the box. I didn't care. Stuart finished at 10 and handed me 2 new sets of keys, one for the front door, one for the back. I put one set in my jacket pocket. I put the other in the kitchen drawer, where Dolores keeps the things that belong to this horse and to no one else. That afternoon, I drove out to the house on Agate Beach Drive with Caleb in the passenger seat and delivered the news to Derek and Camille the way the situation called for, directly and without ceremony. They were both home. Derek was in the kitchen, Camille in the living room, and the atmosphere between them had the particular quality of a silence that has followed a great deal of noise. I stood in the hallway with Caleb at my back and looked at my son and my daughter-in-law and said, "You have 2 weeks to find another place. Take what's yours. Leave what's mine." Camille's face moved through a sequence of expressions. Disbelief landing, first, then something that looked like the front edge of a fight. Then her eyes went to Derek, who was staring at the kitchen floor, and whatever she found in his expression killed the argument where it stood. 2 weeks, I said once more. Caleb and I walked out. They didn't require those 2 weeks. 11 days was all it took, which told me the shape of their finances without my needing to ask a single question. Newport's rental market shows no mercy, and 3 years of living rent-free had apparently left them with less of a cushion than either of them had counted on. None of that was by my design. It was the ordinary arithmetic of treating another person's property like it cost nothing. Dolores and I returned to the house on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-July, and the silence that met us was immediate. Caleb hauled boxes. Dolores went through the rooms one by one with the unhurried purpose of someone who knows exactly what she is reclaiming. I watched her level a crooked picture, pull a window open, and then plant both hands on the kitchen counter and breathe a real breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind that belongs to a person who has just gotten back, something she wasn't entirely sure she'd see again. Derek and Camille's final night under that roof was a Thursday. Caleb told me what unfolded there the following weekend. The two of us out on the dock, his feet dangling over the water, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone recounting events rather than reliving them. The argument that erupted wasn't the grinding low-register friction of two people trying to preserve something. It was high volume and accusatory, the kind that ignites when a scheme has failed, and both parties are scrambling to make the wreckage the other one's doing. Camille had said, "You told me this house was going to be ours." Derek had said, "Who told you to put your hands on my father?" Camille had said, "Who held his arms?" Caleb had been perched on the stairs the whole time. Every word reached him. He told me he'd expected to feel some satisfaction and hadn't found any, which caught him off guard. What he found instead was exhaustion. The particular kind, he said, that arrives when something you've long known was damaged, finally gives out completely and confirms a thing you were quietly hoping you were wrong about. I said that was a remarkably mature thing to feel. He said he wasn't convinced that was meant as praise. I told him it wasn't purely praise, but it wasn't the opposite of it either, and that ambiguity made him laugh. First time I'd heard that since before the party. It felt like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed too long. About a week after Derek and Camille cleared out, a text message arrived from Camille, Sunday evening back porch, the last light draining off the bay. 4 sentences. She was sorry for how things had ended. She hoped that with time, I'd come to see she had only ever had the family's interest at heart. She acknowledged she'd made some mistakes, and then tucked in at the end, wearing the clothing of an afterthought, would it be all right if she held on to a spare key just for emergencies? I read it a second time. Then I went to the kitchen and pulled open the junk drawer, the wide one on the left, home to dead batteries and rubber bands, and the small screwdrivers that never surface when you actually need them. Both spare keys were in there, the ones Stuart had made for the old locks, which I'd kept for no reason I could have articulated. I pressed them to the back of the drawer, behind all the clutter, and shoved it closed. I returned to the porch. I watched the last color leave the water. I never answered the message, and I had no interest in accounting for why. Dolores appeared 20 minutes on, carrying 2 cups of tea settled in beside me, and placed one in my hand without asking. We stayed out there until the harbor lights blinked on. Dolores has an aptitude for knowing what's coming, not in any supernatural way. She'd be the first to dismiss that framing. She pays attention is all, but she does it with a rigor and constancy that makes most people's version of paying attention look like glancing up from a book. When Audra was 16, Dolores saw that the boy across the street would eventually be a problem, well before he'd done anything to earn that assessment. When Derek was 34, she registered a slight change in how he spoke about money, a looseness that hadn't been there before, the cadence of someone whose appetite had quietly outpaced what they'd admit to wanting. Everything she noticed, she stored. She held it and watched it develop. She knew what Camille was before I'd begun to suspect. I grasped that completely now. August came to Newport the way it always comes, marine layered, dissolving around 10, the foot traffic on Bay Boulevard, thickening the water, going smooth and silvery by mid-afternoon. The house on Agate Beach Drive wore a silence it hadn't known in 3 years. I was aware of it the way you become aware of the absence of a persistent noise, one that had been in the background long enough that you'd stopped registering it as noise at all, and only now in its absence could you hear how constant it had been. Caleb had taken over the back bedroom. His textbooks rose in a neat column on the desk I'd built against the window 20 years ago, and above it, he'd pinned a map of the Oregon Coast Aquarium display to the wall, which gave me a small private satisfaction. He came down for breakfast with us each morning before school showed up at the stall on Saturday afternoons, and was applying himself with real seriousness to understanding the difference between Pacific halibut and California. Halibut, a distinction that matters to anyone buying fish, and therefore worth learning properly. Late August, a Thursday evening dinner finished the dishes put away. Dolores and I were on the back porch. Caleb was somewhere inside working on his laptop. Out in the harbor, things moved at the unhurried summer pace, the smell of salt and diesel and that deep organic undertone that tells you the water has life in it and that life is doing its work. Dolores set her cup down. "There's something I need to say to you," she told me, "and this time I'd like you to genuinely hear it." I looked over at her. "Have I ever not heard you?" She gave me the look that requires no translation. 17 times Leonard. I set down my tea. What she told me next came in the sequence it had actually occurred, which was not the sequence I'd been piecing together on my own, because I had only ever possessed my end of the story, not hers. She described the first night Camille came through the house and what she'd observed in Camille's expression that I had walked right past. She walked me through each of the 17 conversations she'd had with Derek, precisely because Dolores does not speak approximately about things she has kept count of. She showed me how Derek had lifted her words, reversed their meaning, and carried them back to me as something she had never said. How she had stood in her own home and heard me relay her own voice back at her, saying things she hadn't said. She hadn't challenged it in the moment because she had no interest in turning the living room into a battlefield, but she had lain awake afterward more than once, jaw clenched tight from the discipline of not speaking. "You should have come to me," I said. She regarded me with the patience of someone who has been conserving it specifically for this moment. "I came to you 17 times, Leonard. You should have pressed harder." "Perhaps," she said, "and you might have worked harder at listening. That particular shortcoming belongs to both of us equally if you'd like to split it." I had nothing to say to that, which was the appropriate response because she was correct, and neither of us needed to pretend otherwise. Pastor Hugh Calloway came by the following Saturday morning. 70 years old, 22 years at the head of Harbor View Community Church's congregation, and carrying with him the unhurried stillness of a man who has spent those decades alongside people at their lowest, and has learned somewhere along the way that presence often does more than anything he could say. He had a habit of showing up with coffee from the place on Bay Boulevard, 2 cups that morning, one for each of us, which told me Dolores had phoned him ahead of time. We settled at the kitchen table. He told me Camille had come to see him in March. She had taken the chair across from his desk and described what she called a family transition, a voluntary and cooperative arrangement, by which Leonard and Dolores were preparing to step away from the property and the business and pass the reins to the next generation. She had asked whether he would be willing to serve as what she called a spiritual witness to the transfer, someone who could attest that the handover was freely given. Pastor Hugh had told her he would need both Leonard and Dolores in the room for any conversation of that kind. Camille had said that Leonard was tired and not always clear on the specifics of such matters, and that Dolores had already made her support known privately. Pastor Hugh had told her that wasn't how it worked. She had thanked him and walked out and never returned. I looked at Hugh across the table. "She told you I wasn't always clear on the details." "She did," he said. "She used nearly the same language with Franklin's colleague," I said. "Not fully engaged in the process." Hugh nodded. He circled his coffee cup with both hands. "Leonard, the reason I'm bringing this to you now rather than in March is that Dolores called me in January and asked me to let her know if anything unusual came up involving the property or the business." I turned and looked at my wife. Dolores lifted her tea. "I told you I paid attention," she said. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway in his Saturday clothes, ready for the stall. He looked at Pastor Hugh, then at his grandmother, then at me. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Everything is fine," Dolores said. "Come sit down." Hugh had brought enough coffee. Caleb sat. Hugh poured him a half cup and added enough milk to make it drinkable for a 14-year-old, without insulting the coffee. Exactly the right call. Caleb looked at me over his mug. "Grandpa," he said. "Grandma's kind of terrifying, isn't she?" Dolores turned to look at him, expression fully composed, not a trace of apology in it. "Yes," I said. "She is. It's why I married her." Dolores lifted her tea again and looked out the kitchen window at the morning light lying across the garden. I watched her face in profile, the way I have been watching her face in profile for 41 years. I thought about 17 times. Counted conversations. A phone call to a pastor in January. And I understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt that the person who had been quietly holding this family together was right beside me and had been the whole time. Hugh stayed for another hour. When he left, Caleb and I walked down to the stall together. Halfway there, Caleb said, "Grandpa, did you know Grandma called Pastor Hugh in January?" "No," I said. He took that in, slowly turning it over. "She's a step ahead of everyone," he said. I looked at him. "Always has been," I said. I just keep forgetting. Derek called on a Thursday evening in October. I was in the living room with a fishing industry newsletter Calvin had passed along. Dolores was in the kitchen making soup from the last of the summer tomatoes, the smell of it drifting through the house in that unhurried way that good things have when they aren't announcing themselves. My phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. Derek. I let it ring twice. Dolores appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand, eyes moving from the phone to me. I raised one finger. She nodded and went back to her soup. 41 years of marriage distills itself into gestures like that. I answered on the third ring. He told me there was no friend with medical bills. He had needed the $12,000 to cover a credit card debt Camille didn't know about. Taking it from me had seemed easier than telling the truth. He had convinced himself he'd pay it back before I noticed. Did you believe that when you said it? I asked. A pause. I wanted to. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It's not. Then he said the thing that cost him the most. Dad, I held your arms. The house was quiet around me, the soup on the stove, the harbor somewhere past the rooftops. I know what you did, Derek, I said. I keep seeing your face when I... He stopped. He couldn't get to the end of it. I didn't press him. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, I said. It isn't, but you called. That's not nothing. His voice came out rough. I don't know how to fix it, Dad. I know you don't, I said. That's why you called. We stayed on the line a moment longer. Then I told him to get some sleep. Dolores was in the doorway when I set the phone down. How did he sound? She asked. I considered it. Like a man who finally added up what something cost him and reached the total. She looked at me, then turned back toward the kitchen. Soup's ready, she said. Come eat. January in Newport is cold in a way that rises off the water and finds every gap between your collar and your jacket and stays there. I was at the stall at 4:15. Lights on counter wiped, and Calvin had a cod delivery arriving at 5. I was arranging the display case when I heard a truck turn into the lot. I recognized the engine. I didn't turn around right away. I set the last filly in place, straightened up, and then looked. Derek was standing at the entrance to the stall. He had on Derek's old canvas work jacket, the dark green one from before the warehouse job. His boots were the ones he used to wear when he came out to help me on the Saturday mornings in his 20s. He wasn't carrying anything. No bag, no envelope, nothing prepared in his hands. We looked at each other across the counter. Dad, he said. His breath made a small cloud in the cold air. Do you need help? I looked at my son. I looked at the jacket, the boots, the hands held open at his sides, empty available. And I thought about a Thursday call in October. A business plan, with my name on it, $12,000 and $25,000, a bowl of drawn butter striking hardwood, and the sound of 2 blows I will never fully unhear. I reached under the counter. I pulled out the spare apron, the old canvas one, the one that carries 35 years of salt and fish and early mornings in its fibers. I set it on the counter between us. Then I pointed to the far corner of the stall where 4 crates of yesterday's catch waited to be scrubbed before the fresh order came in. Wash those, I said. Derek picked up the apron. He tied it without glancing down. The way you tie something when your hands recall the motion, even when the rest of you is still finding its footing. He walked to the corner, took up the brush, opened the hose, and got to work. I turned back to the display case. At 6:15, Caleb arrived on his bicycle, cheeks red from the cold backpack on one shoulder. He came into the stall and pulled up short when he spotted his father scrubbing crates in the corner. He looked at Derek, then he looked at me. I nodded toward the scale. Come learn how to weigh the cod, I said. Caleb hung his backpack on the hook. By the entrance, stepped behind the counter and took a place beside me. I showed him how to read the digital scale, how to account for the weight of the tray, how to write the number down clearly so there was no confusion at the register. Behind us, Derek's working sounds continued. Steady, unhurried, the sound of someone who has decided that showing up is the only currency he has right now and has resolved that it is enough to start with. The delivery arrived at 5. Calvin brought it in himself, took one look at the 3 of us and said nothing. He set the crates down, signed the receipt, and left. Some mornings carry their meaning without anyone needing to name it. Christmas came to Agate Beach Drive on a Thursday. Dolores put lights on the porch for the first time in 4 years. I noticed. I didn't say a word. I just watched her string them along the railing in the early afternoon and thought about all the Christmases those lights had waited in a box in the hall closet. We had a small dinner. Audra and her husband, Caleb Derek. No performance, no 16 people, and arranged platters, just the table. We had food that Dolores and I put together, while Caleb sat at the counter, peppering us with questions about the difference between a dry brine and a wet brine, which is exactly the kind of question that tells you a boy is actually paying attention. Derek came early. He helped me set the table without waiting to be asked. He knew the house had grown up inside it, and watching him pull open the correct drawer for the serving spoons, without so much as a glance, was one of the stranger and more ordinary moments that year held for me. Dinner was good, the kind of good that doesn't call for anyone to remark on it. Afterward, when everyone had gone and Dolores was asleep, I stood in the dark kitchen and slid open the junk drawer. The spare key was right where I'd left it back in July, tucked behind the batteries and the rubber bands. I looked at it for a moment, then I shut the drawer. Not yet. Maybe one day, but not because someone said sorry in a text message at midnight. When that key comes out of that drawer, it will be because it was earned. The same way a boy learns to read a scale properly. The same way a man learns to show up before the sun is up and ask for nothing but the work itself. I switched off the kitchen light. I've been rising at 4 in the morning for 35 years. Tomorrow will be no different. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you for that. This story took something out of me to tell, and I imagine it took something out of you to hear. I think about what this cost, not just the money, not the $12,000 or the $25,000, not the stolen accounts or the forged name. What it cost was trust, the kind you build across decades without even thinking about it because it's just the water you swim in. Losing that to your own son is a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. I believe God doesn't waste that kind of pain. The path back wasn't loud or sudden. It was a boy on a bicycle in the cold, a spare apron set on a counter, a man tying it without looking down. That's how it began again. Here is what I'd want anyone to take from this, especially those of us who have lived long enough to know how quietly things can go wrong. Pay attention to what you sign and what stays in your name. Convenience can become a door left open. If someone keeps speaking for a person who is standing right there, ask why. The person with the loudest explanation is not always the one telling the truth. When a young person chooses to do the hard right thing in a room full of adults, honor that. It costs them more than they let on. And if you're wondering whether it's too late to begin again with someone you love, a spare apron on a counter says more than most apologies ever could. This is the kind of family revenge story that I think about when people say that older adults have nothing left to fight for. Leonard Garrett was 68 years old, and he fought for his name, his home, and his wife's dignity, quietly, legally, and with patience that most people half his age couldn't manage. For the adults, 50 plus, who feel like they've been written off or overlooked, I hope this one stayed with you. If it moved you, leave a thought in the comments. I do read them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribing to Honor Revenge Stories means the next one will find you when it's ready. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.